Hello there! Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing absolutely fabulous, and I'm so thrilled you've joined me for part 3 of our story. We've just learnt the tragic news that Alexa Muldooney has fallen to her death from a very high balcony railing. And of course she was responsible for doing handstands on that railing, which she did every single day, and she felt very certain that she was safe, until unfortunately somebody pushed her, and we all know who that is, Jane Goodlington's brother, who has got a vengeance against Alexa because he came out of prison and she wanted nothing more to do with him. So we're now on part 3 of our story tonight, and let's get started with our story. Maggie Barclay. Maggie was trying to find some shelter at the bus stop. She knew her husband Callum would prefer her to use an Uber taxi to get home, but that was so much more expensive, although Maggie could easily afford the expense. Money was not the problem these days, given her husband Callum was doing reasonably well on the financial front, but that was not the point. Maggie, who had come from a less than affluent background, believed in spending money very wisely and being scrupulous at all times. Despite being married for over 20 years, she had never got out of the habit of counting the pennies and being very savvy with the family's money. She had decided that taking a bus from town seemed like a sensible idea, although now she was rather reconsidering this, as the rain belted down indiscriminately. It was such a dreadful pity that her car was still in residence at the car dealership. She was told that it would not be available for collection, as it was a Japanese model, requiring specialized parts that they didn't have in stock at the moment. She knew that any trips to town would mean taking the bus. She'd met up this morning with a very good friend of hers called Meredith for coffee, but she hadn't anticipated the weather taking a nasty turn for the worse like this. That was when she noticed the same young teenager, who was probably about 18 years old, although she couldn't be sure. He'd been hanging around the coffee shop when she'd been having coffee with Meredith. Now the seedy-looking youth was hanging around the bus shelter like a bad smell. He was scruffy and unkempt. He looked like he'd slept in the same clothes for weeks on end, and was a board-certified jerk as far as she was concerned. This was almost certainly affirmed for her, when out of his ugly, seemingly trendy camouflage jacket, he pulled out a packet of Marlboro cigarettes, removing one from the packaging, which he lit up with a cheap lighter. He then began to unabashedly smoke in people's faces, blowing out pillows of fumes as if they were kids' air bubbles. People were huddled together rather tightly under the canopy of the bus shelter, as it continued to pour with rain. The young man didn't seem to care a jot that he was rudely filling people's lungs up with the noxious smoke. An elderly woman began to cough and splutter as she held on to her shopping tote bag, loaded with all kinds of shopping she had just purchased. The poor woman waved a withered, rather veiny hand in front of her face. She looked less than amused by the teenager's rudeness. Who could blame her for that? The teenager was tall and lanky, wearing tight-fitting black denim jeans, with deliberately designer-engineered rips or tears, if you like, around the knee area, so it looked as if he had a sequence of ladders in his pants. There were piercings in his ears and his nose, as well as his upper lips. His skin was as white and pale as a piece of paper, and he had abrupt outbreaks of spots around his chin area, which suggested he had a poor diet. He seemed totally oblivious to the offence he'd caused with his antisocial, inappropriate behaviour. He was wearing a small backpack on his back that he carried rather casually on his shoulders. It was swinging around inappropriately, slamming into people's backs. Maggie glared at him, but he failed to notice her disapproving looks. The bus pulled up to the curb and made a hissing sound as it finally drew to a stop. The ramp was making a beeping sound, beep, 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 as it was lowered for the old woman, so that she could easily get onto the bus with her shopping tote. Maggie helped the grateful woman with her heavy tote, boarding after her. She took a vacant window seat near the front end of the bus and set her purse on her lap, while she waited rather patiently for the other people to board after her. She observed the rain was still coming down in cats and dogs, and was heartily relieved to be in the dry on the bus, not stuck in the cold rain. She could only hope and pray that when she got off the bus at her stop, that the rain would have abated by then, because it was quite a walk from her stop through the woods to her house, and she didn't like the idea of getting wet, as she foolishly had not brought an umbrella along with her. The blonde teenager, with his long, straggly, rather unkempt hair, that was so incredibly greasy, you could probably have fried your chips in the fat it created. He threw his cigarette onto the wet concrete of the bus shelter, stamping it out rather viciously with one of his heavy boots. He then scrambled awkwardly onto the bus and began to grovel with the driver. Why was Maggie not remotely surprised by this? She wondered how very often the poor bus driver had to put up with all these ridiculous sob stories from people wanting a free ride. "Hey, man, will you cut me a break? I really need to get this bus. It's coming down in sheets out there. I'm completely skint, got no money to pay for the fare." The bus driver grumbled. "Right, just this once. But don't you make a habit of it, young man, because everyone on this bus has to pay their fare, and I can't be seen to be giving some people special favours, if you get my drift." The young man nodded and walked onto the bus, failing to even thank the driver for his kindness. He shook off the rain from his camouflage jacket like a wet dog, getting water all over the bus. The smell of his cigarette smoke wafted around the bus, as the young man smelt like a portable cigarette tray. He trudged over to a seat preserved for the elderly and disabled, removing his backpack and placing it on the seat next to him, so that he now occupied 2 seats. The teenager pulled out a familiar brown bag from his backpack. It was marked McDonald's. He removed what appeared to be a cheeseburger bun from inside the packaging. He began to hungrily devour the burger, eating it with his mouth wide open, so that Maggie could see him churning his food. He messily spilled crumbs everywhere, all over the seat and all over the bus floor. He then began to eat a small bag of McDonald's fried chips, which he stuffed into his mouth in stacked handfuls. The bus now began to smell of cheeseburger, which made Maggie want to gag. There was a sign in the bus clearly stipulating for no eating and drinking was allowed on the bus, but rules were clearly meant to be broken by this layabout teenager, who gave them scant regard. If he was a dog, he'd have probably thought nothing of lifting his leg on one of the seats. The old lady seated on the seat opposite the young man gave him a dirty look, and the teenager just smirked at her with a gleeful look on his face, almost as if he knew very well his seat was reserved for the elderly, and knowing he was occupying a seat that he shouldn't be in seemed to give him a certain amount of satisfaction, as if he rather got off on the idea of being rebellious by nature and ruffling everybody's feathers very successfully, which he clearly had done. The teenager rolled up his burger patty paper and the brown paper bag it had come in, along with the cardboard that had contained the hot chips. He tossed them all onto the floor of the bus in a crumpled heap. The old lady rolled her eyes in disgusted revulsion, her pale blue eyes buried beneath folds of crinkled flesh. She met Maggie's gaze. The 2 women locked gazes together, as if they were privately conjoined in their disgust over this teenager. The old lady was not remotely impressed, but she seemed to know better than to say anything, although her lips did quiver rather awkwardly, as if she was tempted to reprimand the teenager. If anything, this teenager had absorbed Maggie's undivided attention. She watched him wrestling around rather awkwardly with his backpack, as if he was stumbling around in the darkness looking for something that he couldn't find. Eventually he hit pay dirt, pulling out an iPad, and then replacing it inside the bag. He then pulled out a smartphone and began to tap away at it with his filthy fingers. Maggie stared at him in abject shock. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. The young teenager was clearly not as skint as he had claimed to be, even though he could easily pass for being homeless, judging by the scruffy way he presented himself to the world. Did the teenager have no shame at all? He could clearly afford to buy a pack of cigarettes at $9 a pack, a burger from McDonald's, iPads and smartphones, You would think he could easily afford to pay the $2.50 bus ticket. It was clear he was an opportunist who took great delight in exploiting people's kindness. Maggie did not know whether to be amused, entertained, or very disgusted by this young teenager's audacity, so she found herself scowling at the young teenager rather indignantly. The young teenager clearly sensed Maggie's intrusive, rather disgruntled look that she directed at him. He returned her objectionable gaze with a frosty glare that drilled right through her, so that immediately in embarrassment she looked away and pretended to be examining the beaded raindrops on the glass pane of the bus. She did not like this big creep one little bit. He was objectionable, to say the very least, an unsavoury character, the kind of thug that if you encountered down a dark alleyway would make you call 911 even before he attacked you, because you would be absolutely certain he would. Indeed, as Maggie thought about it, she could easily visualize the young teenager pickpocketing people's bags and breaking into cars. She could see him joyriding down roads, burglarizing people's homes while they were out. She could not help but cautiously wonder whether the iPad and the smartphone she had observed in his possession were ill-gotten gains. She was almost certain they were. She wondered privately what other treasures lay stashed away in that backpack of his. A plethora of people's cell phones, she suspected. She'd have liked to have given the young teenager the benefit of the doubt, in the way the bus driver obviously had. But everything about him, most especially his stinky attitude, was very unbecoming. She could hear him now grumbling away on the phone. She tried to eavesdrop as to what he was saying. "Sophia! Can you hear me? Can you hear me, Sophia? Yes, I'm on the bus. I'm hot on the trail, just so you know. Keep you posted," he said, closing his phone and giving Maggie a formidable glare. Once again she quickly looked away. I don't like him, Maggie thought. What kind of a parent raises a child like this? He is so awful. She found herself grasping her purse very much more tightly on her lap, as if she was half afraid he'd hold up the bus all of a sudden and snatch everybody's valuables from them before making his grand escape, like the robbers on the great train robbery. Maggie glanced around the bus rather nervously, sensing the young teenager's gaze was still locked on her. But she pretended not to know this, that he was looking straight at her. She once again glanced out of the rain-beaded window and began to inwardly pray that the rain would stop its deluge. The bus finally did stop at various destinations, until it was only Maggie left on the bus, along with this young teenager. Naturally, his presence made her feel all the more uneasy, but there was no way he could be getting off at the location she was getting off at. She lived in an area that was pretty sequestered, and she'd never seen this teenager before, so he clearly didn't live in her part of the world, or she'd almost certainly have known about it. Maggie was heartily relieved to see the rain had finally abated. She pressed the bell for the next stop, looking around rather awkwardly to see that the young teenager appeared to be fixated on his smartphone. That was a relief. He didn't appear to even notice her. The bus hissed as it came to a grinding halt, and Maggie hurriedly clambered off, heartily relieved to see the young, irritating teenager had not got off at her stop. Thank God, she thought. She told herself she was being ridiculous. He was probably harmless anyway, but she hadn't liked him at all. She grimaced as she walked down the earthen road, where pools of water covered the pathway like tiny ponds. She observed a couple of frogs were darting around happily. Maggie was absolutely exhausted by the time she reached the turning in the end of the road that gave her a convenient shortcut through the woods. She was certain she'd heard the bus hissing and stopping once again, but gave the matter no more attention until she noticed coming down the road towards where she'd got off from the bus was the young teenager. Oh my God! He was clearly looking for her. His head was turning around backwards and forwards. He ran towards the bus drop-off point and began looking up and down the road, his eyes then fixated on the woods. Maggie remembered how the young teenager had spotted her in the coffee shop earlier on in the morning. Then he'd taken the same bus as her, and now she was absolutely certain he was actually following her. Did he want revenge because she had glared at him on the bus? Surely not. He wasn't that small-minded. Maggie made sure she could not be seen, while she clandestinely took cover behind a tree at the edge of the woods. The young teenager was clearly looking for her. She was in no doubt about that now. He certainly didn't seem amused to have lost her. Maggie's heart began to pound violently in her chest. She felt conspicuously vulnerable, very alone. There wasn't a solitary soul in sight to help her, should she need that help. The young man looked towards the woods. He examined the muddy ground before him. Maggie suspected she must have left a trail of footprints behind, as the teenager began to follow the trail into the woods, looking decidedly pleased with himself, rather like a skilled tracker that had found an unlikely trail he'd been looking for. My God, there was no doubt he was definitely stalking her. Why, oh why, had Maggie not listened to her husband, and listened to his reasoned advice in taking an Uber taxi instead of the bus? Why was she always trying to save money, when there was no need of that? Then none of this would have happened to her. Maggie's heart began performing a series of acrobatic leapfrogs in her chest. Her pulse began to race as she stepped up her speed and ran ahead into the woods. Thank God she was wearing sensible shoes. She knew the young teenager, with his long, nimble legs, would likely catch up with her pretty soon. If need be, she could take cover and hide here in the woods. He'd never know that she knew he was stalking her. So she did have a slim advantage on him, having spotted him through the trees. She inwardly wailed as she prayed for the safe sanctuary of her home. It felt like she had to run through a labyrinth of trees until she finally reached her homestead. Focus, she told herself. You can do this, Maggie. You can do this. Even though she had her cell phone at her disposal, she did not want to call anyone at this moment. It was far too risky. She might be overheard by the young man, and even texting someone might take minutes of her time that she could ill afford to lose. She needed to get away fast. She had haunting images of the young blonde man pouncing on her, slashing her throat with a sharp knife, all because she had glared at him on the bus. Maybe he had some kind of psychiatric disorder, was slightly unhinged. She wouldn't be remotely surprised if that was the case. He certainly fitted the profile of somebody like that. Maybe he'd escaped from a mental asylum and was now living rough on the streets. Supposing he'd failed to take his medication that helped him to stay in his right frame of mind. She did recall watching a documentary once about a young man who went on a random killing spree, simply because he was not in his right mind. "Why did you do it?" he was asked by the interviewer. "I forgot to take my medications," he had said, "and when I don't take them, I am consumed with a desire to kill anything that touches my path." The memory of the documentary resounded in Maggie's ears like a clanging bell. There was something not right about this young man, she knew it. She had seen his outlandish behaviour on the bus, and knew instinctively he could not be trusted by any manner of means. He was a nasty character. She suddenly heard leaves crunching, twigs breaking, and she knew without a shadow of a doubt that the young man was quickly gaining ground on her. That was when she had the idea to climb one of the trees that was covered in curtains of shrubbery. If she hid clandestinely among the high branches, hopefully the young man would never find her. Maggie would not describe herself as nimble, far from it in fact. But when you're desperately afraid for your life, your adrenaline throbs through your bloodstream like a freight train on full throttle. And when it does this so seamlessly, it's amazing what incredible feats you can accomplish, which in a normal state of mind would seem close to impossible and well beyond reach. How she did it, Maggie did not remember. Her memory at this point in time went blank, like a piece of paper, devoid of any writing on it. In a hasty, determined scramble, she managed to climb up the tree, where she hid among the branches, remaining quiet as she possibly could. She observed the young teenager walking past her down the earthen trail, kicking his boots on the ground so that leaves and debris flew ahead of him. She caught a quick glimpse of his camouflage jacket and black ripped jeans. He was failing to look up in the trees above his head, probably thinking that someone like Maggie would never hide there because she probably couldn't reach the branches in the first place. Normally he'd have been right about that. When he coughed, she nearly jumped out of her skin. She held her breath tightly, terrified he'd hear her raspy breathing, which appeared very loud in her own ears. So much so that she was absolutely certain that the entire forest had heard her. She was lucky, as the woodgrove was quite overgrown, with shrubbery growing indiscriminately between the trees, and it was rather dense, rather like hair growing inappropriately out of someone's ears. She was flooded with huge relief as the teenager walked past her. She clung tightly to the branches, high up in the tree, absolutely terrified that the young man would finally see her. It had not even crossed her mind that he could be completely harmless, for she was filled with a dreadful terror. Maggie was still far too anxious to come down the branches of the tree, even though she probably couldn't have done so, even if she'd wanted to. It was late afternoon, drifting into early evening, and gradually becoming dark. She had no concept of the time, or how long she'd remained up in the tree for, but her fear had tethered her to the branches, as if she had been stuck to them by superglue. It was only when the teenager walked back the way he'd come that Maggie decided to climb down the tree. But while it had been so easy for her to get up it, because she couldn't even remember how she'd done it, it was almost impossible to go down the same way she'd come. She'd never been remotely athletic at the very best of times, and now she began to panic. She decided she should phone her husband, wrestled around in her purse for her cell phone, but her fingers were like butter, and the cell phone unfortunately slipped out of her fingers, landing somewhere in the undergrowth. She doubted that even when she reached the ground, whether she would recover her cell phone. It could be buried anywhere beneath the leaves and shrubbery, and would be close to impossible to find. It was when Maggie heard a man whistle that she was flooded with immense relief. Furthermore, she knew who was whistling. It was the rancher who lived next door to them, a man called Timmy Tomahawk, and that man never stopped whistling. You could always hear him coming from a mile away, before you even saw the man. The woodgrove was the in-between space that bordered her neighbour's property from their own. Timmy Tomahawk often took his big black dog Jumbo for a walk in the woods, in the late afternoon and early evening. He had told her all about it, and she'd almost forgotten about that. This was a stroke of very good fortune. Maggie was certain the kind gentleman would help her down from the tree, but she needed to get his attention first. The kind rancher may wonder what she was doing there, perched up high on the tree branches in the first place. Would he think she was completely balmy, especially if she told him that a young teenage lout had stalked her from the bus drop-off point, following her into the woods, so she'd hidden from him? Would he even believe her unlikely story? But Maggie felt too exhausted to actually care about that. Her family would be awfully worried about her by now, if she failed to return home. She needed some help getting down this tree. She was absolutely terrified she'd fall and break an ankle. Maggie began to cry out for Timmy's help. "Timmy! Timmy, is that you? Timmy, is that you? I'm stuck up on a tree. It's Maggie Barclay. Timmy!" She sighed with relief when she heard feet running towards her. Timmy had always struck her as a rather lean, nimble man, who was rather light on his feet. But he ran through the woodgrove towards her, with what seemed like a thunderous footfall, and she didn't hear any dog barking, which was rather unusual. The ground seemed to vibrate under his weight. Maybe he was heavier than she remembered him to be. Maggie felt relieved to know he was on his way to her. He'd easily get her down this tree, with a little help on his part. Maggie saw the figure approach her. At first she did wonder why on such a warm day that Timmy Tomahawk appeared to be wearing a woolly onesie. He looked much bigger than she remembered him to be. But as she looked down at the figure, looking up at her, high in the branches, she realized to her horror she was staring at a female Bigfoot. Maggie was so dumbfounded, so disquieted by this enigmatic, paradoxical, and absurd encounter, that in her abject shock she almost fell straight out of the tree. She began to wonder if she was so overtired, so exhausted, so fatigued that she was now seeing things that weren't actually there. But that was wishful thinking on her part, and she knew it. The Bigfoot was definitely real. Maggie felt anxiety seize through her bone, marrow, and sinew like a supercharged adrenal rush. But her fear response made her freeze up like a solid block of ice. She found herself clinging tightly to the branches, rather helplessly, as the Bigfoot's dark treacle-coloured eyes surveyed her, taking her all in, with a curious intrigue and a somewhat amused look. The creature clearly had a sense of humour, and maybe it was rather funny seeing Maggie stuck up in a tree like this. The Bigfoot probably was wondering how on earth she'd got there in the first place. Maggie had no way of knowing how to react to this Bigfoot, who was clearly female, based on her small breasts that were almost completely shrouded by long curtains of dark hair. She was powerfully built, stocky, robust, and burly. Maggie felt incredibly intimidated by her sheer imposing size. How big was this thing, she wondered? And was she going to harm her? What shall I do to get away from her, Maggie thought. But as she asked herself these questions, she was surprised when the Bigfoot spoke to her in a language she could not understand. It astonished her that the Bigfoot actually spoke to her in an intelligible language. And Maggie knew with a profound intelligence like this, the Bigfoot was both discerning and clever. What happened next completely amazed and mesmerized Maggie, as the words the Bigfoot spoke to her were automatically translated in her mind in some kind of miraculous telepathic exchange. Kilati, sogolasina, fa ki sakwasha, ha kilasina, hobani kilasun. You have nothing to fear. I'm here to help you. Do you want to come down from that tree or not? Or do you want to stay there all evening? I heard you calling out for help. I came to your rescue. Shall I leave you be? Or would you like me to help you get down from the tree? I can see you're struggling to make your way down. I could always walk away if you'd prefer. But I'm a guardian of the forest, and I like to help anybody that's in trouble. No, please don't leave me, said Maggie, suddenly realizing that life had come back to her frozen body, as if the ice within her had all but melted away. This intimidating Bigfoot wanted to help her, and Maggie absolutely believed her. The energy she exuded was benevolent and kind. The Bigfoot was so incredibly tall, about 9 foot or so, but she had persuaded Maggie to loosen her grip from the branches and free fall, so that she would catch Maggie. Maggie was not comfortable about this maneuver, but she had a sense that the Bigfoot would not let her down. She was so powerfully built and seemed to be very aware of what she was doing. Maggie needed to trust her, and that is what she would do. Maggie closed her eyes tightly, loosening her grip from the upper branches of the tree. She finally let go and began to free fall. And before she could worry about taking a nasty tumble, the Bigfoot's powerful arms caught her very easily. The Bigfoot gently placed her on the ground, as if she was a tiny, fragile porcelain doll. It felt a little like she was being handled incredibly gently by King Kong himself. Thank you so much, said Maggie, gathering the purse that she'd thrown to the ground. The Bigfoot appeared to be bending over some dense shrubbery and fumbling around for something, and then the Bigfoot pulled out her cell phone, handing it to Maggie. Maggie took it from her, astounded. How did you know it was there? She asked the Bigfoot. Kilati, posasha, the blue light, she said. I could see the blue light. It was clear to Maggie that the Bigfoot could see frequencies that were invisible to a human's naked eye. Maggie's body felt so stiff as she began to walk through the trees, with a female Bigfoot by her side, who seemed to insist on chaperoning her back to safety, as if the Bigfoot had taken it upon herself to be fully responsible for Maggie's charge. Maggie was touched to the quick by the gentleness of the creature. Even though the Bigfoot never mentioned that she'd seen Maggie before, Maggie got the sense that the Bigfoot knew exactly who she was, and had probably been observing her for many years, in a cloak-and-dagger way behind the trees. In a strange way, this knowledge was comforting to Maggie, for she realized that this female Bigfoot was definitely a guardian of the forest as she described herself to be, watching her with a very protective matriarch-like energy. Maggie recalled how on previous shortcuts she had taken through the woods she always had a sense of knowing that something was watching her. She had never felt threatened by this in any way, but had always felt something was there. When she had expressed these feelings to her husband, he had all but laughed at her and said, "Of course something is there, love. The woodgrove is full of invisible eyes. Birds, chipmunks, squirrels, field mice, rabbits. I could go on, but I won't. So if you feel you're being watched, you probably are. I wouldn't be at all surprised by that." What Callum had failed to realise, that this unsettling feeling of being watched all the time, that Maggie acquired when taking shortcuts through the woodgrove, was not that of a field mouse or a rabbit that was observing her, but something infinitely bigger in size. She had certainly sensed a large, formidable presence in her midst. She had decided better than discussing these feelings with her husband, for fear that he might discourage her from walking in the woods. Maggie had shaken those bizarre feelings off as just the musings of an overactive imagination on her part. Now she considered that all this time maybe the female Bigfoot had been watching over her, and she was certain that this was the case. With the Bigfoot now at her side, the thought of the young teenager that had followed her from the drop-off point at the bus stop made her almost feel rather foolish. Maybe he had not meant to harm her after all. But Maggie was absolutely certain that the seedy-looking character had indeed been following her. But why? She couldn't imagine. When Maggie reached the edge of the woodgrove, she observed the reassuring, comforting silhouette of her beloved farmhouse. Most of the lights were on inside. It was shrouded by a curtain of darkness that had cloaked the sky, but thankfully the round circle of a light gossamer moon cast her shadows of light all over the landscape, so at least Maggie could see where she was going. Even the crickets and frogs had come out to sing their evening, very tuneful chorus. She felt her heart leaping with happiness to be home again. She was glad that this less than pleasant day was now finally behind her, where half of it had been spent, unfortunately parked up a tree. She thanked the Bigfoot and bounded towards her house, glancing ever so briefly over her shoulders to see that the Bigfoot was still watching her, waiting for her to get indoors. When Maggie finally opened the front door, she decided to keep the events of the day a secret. For a start, she knew her husband Callum would not be remotely impressed if he knew she'd been followed by an unsavoury teenager from the bus stop. She could imagine his reaction. He would likely lecture her about her penny-pinching ways. "You see, this wouldn't have happened if you'd taken an Uber like a normal person. What were you thinking, Maggie? I'm sorry, love, but you brought this on yourself." She didn't need a lecture from her husband. If she told him about the Bigfoot rescuing her from the tree, he'd probably laugh out loud and ask her if she really had coffee with Meredith in the afternoon at the cafe. Or was the concoction adulterated with magic mushrooms, perhaps? Maggie decided, "No, I'm not going to tell anybody what happened to me today. But one thing is for certain, I hope to God I don't see that dreadful teenager again." Her hopes in that regard would be very short-lived. So there we are. That is the end of part 3. Part 4 is tomorrow night. I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.